During the last energy transition 100 years ago, the major driver of industrial change was the internal combustion engine powered by cheap, plentiful petroleum in the form of gasoline and diesel. And the American industry dominated that sector for decades. We think of GM and Ford and Chrysler as being the big three. The equivalent for this energy transition is basically cheap, abundant, clean electricity coupled with batteries. That's kind of the new industrial model that's emerging during the 2020s. Well, the problem is that China is far, far ahead of North America in terms of dominating battery storage. I think they produce something like 50 or 60% of batteries and all through the battery supply chain. So what should North America's strategy be? Catch up to China with existing technologies, or leap ahead in terms of innovating new battery storage, whatever that might be. So I'm going to talk to Dr. Bentley Allan. He is research director at the Transition Accelerator and also an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University, and the lead author on a roadmap for Canada's battery value chain, building a national strategy for critical minerals and green battery metals. So welcome to the interview, Bentley.
Thank you, Markham. It's great to be back on your show.
Well, great to have you here, because this is exciting stuff, is it not? I mean, here we are on the cusp of probably the greatest and next revolution in industrial revolution, as it were. It almost feels like the 18th century in some respects. Batteries are at the core of it, the heart of this energy transition, and we have some very interesting decisions to make, don't we?
Absolutely, and it is really exciting. It's so fun to live through a period of time in which not only our energy system is being scrambled, but also geopolitics is up in the air. Stressful, but fun.
Yeah, well, stressful indeed. So let's talk about this, because I want to read a quote from Tony Van Buren, who is the Deputy Associate Director for Science and Technology and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And this was in an interview that was conducted it was a Utility Dive. So here it is. It's pretty clear that from the Department of Energy and private investments, that one of the underpinning principles is to bring the battery manufacturing capability back to the United States. But if you invest in technologies that are already going on, like lithium ion, that's primarily in Asia right now. There's no way to repatriate that. So what is the United States very good at? We're very good at innovation, he says. And there are 3 of these laboratories in the San Francisco Bay Area that have gotten together, and they're providing support and working with the private sector to what is the next generation of battery storage, particularly not for electric vehicles, but for stationary storage, for utility scale, for large industrial customers, maybe even for batteries or storage that goes in your garage if you have rooftop solar. What do you think of that whole leaping ahead of where we are and imagining the next generation of battery storage?
Yeah, I think that first of all, anytime that you have someone who's the head of a national laboratory and then me in the same conversation, you should always listen to the person who's in charge of a national laboratory, like Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. They look after the nuclear missiles and the nuclear technologies that defend the United States and Canada. So you should definitely listen to Dr. Van Buren and not to me, but I'll give you my opinion anyway. And I think that my opinion is really colored by a couple things. And one of them is really working very closely with industry on the roadmap that you just mentioned. And when you talk to industry, one of the things that they need long investment certainty. They need to know that the battery technology that they work today, like if the OEMs, if GM develops a new battery today, it wants to be able to use that battery in its cars for 10, 15, 20 years, because it takes a really long time to steer a really large OEM like GM or Ford. So they need that kind of stability in the supply chain and stability in the basic foundational technologies that they're using in order to do what they do well, which is crank on the actual mass production side of things, right? And once we really take seriously the role of mass production in determining success or failure, I think it becomes it becomes more obvious that there's a false dichotomy being set up here between building current technologies and innovating. Because actually what my report argues and what my work I think has really uncovered is that you actually need manufacturing capacity in order to do innovation really well. If you don't have the product and production lines in order to actually test drive new technologies, if you don't have that expertise at what's called the shop floor level, then it's actually really hard to innovate on these things in deep, deep ways. So of course, the argument that the United States is good at innovation is correct, and that the strategy should double down on innovation. But that does not mean that we don't want to build manufacturing capacity right now for lithium-ion batteries. The second thing I would say is that many of the technologies that are like next, just 5-10 years away, so solid state, different forms for the anode, these things are not things that fundamentally change the battery or the metals requirements that we're talking about here, right? A solid state battery is still going to basically be LFP, so it's going to be lithium iron phosphate, or it's going to be nickel based. So the fundamental metal supply chain from the mine to the battery is going to look broadly the same, and learning how to make cathode really well, learning how to do the chemical processing in order to produce cathode active materials. These are things that are going to pay off regardless of what the next 10 or 20 years of innovation looks like. And then we can get to future batteries that are fundamentally different, like lithium sulfur, which is still basically a lithium ion battery. That might be 10 or 15 years away from commercialization. And then beyond that, there's air and zinc. And these things start to fundamentally change what batteries are composed of. But are we going to really be able to develop those and scale them in the time period that we're now talking about? I mean, just to give you a sense of the scale, while we're talking about energy storage, stationary storage versus vehicles, if you think about, again, the broadest perspective here of geopolitics, the post-war American economy was built on the auto sector, right? Building cars in America and exporting them overseas. That was emblematic of what the US grand strategy was, which was to make the world safe for American supply chains, right? Now, obviously that has reversed, right? We consume Japanese cars and South Korean cars at a higher rate than we export them. But if you think about how you build the engine of an economy that produces jobs, that really drives the way that an economy is going, you need a really big industry to do that. And cars are a really, really big industry. That means that they can be a driver of the energy transition in this kind of fundamental way. If you talk about innovating on stationary storage, the capacity is just not there for that to be transformational for anything. I just heard an interview. I was listening to a podcast last night while I was, doing some plaster work, which is I'm sure what everybody else is doing with their evenings these days. But so I had the numbers right on the top of my head from Jigar Shah himself, and he said to me, the U.S. goal of 50% EVs per year, you need 800 gigawatts of batteries per year, which is actually, that's where the EU supply chain is right now as well. They've got 822 gigawatts of battery production in the pipeline. And that's what the United States will need in order to meet 2030 targets, 50% electric vehicles. That's per year, 800 gigawatts per year. By 2030, most modeling shows that we're going to have cumulative, adding up all of the years until 2030, 150 gigawatts of stationary storage. So it's a drop in the bucket. We're talking 2 or 3% maximum, the size of the battery economy versus the vehicle economy. So if you're going to innovate and focus on stationary storage, you just don't have an economic driver. If you want an economic driver, you want to produce cars, well, we need to produce cars now for 2030. That means we have to do it on the current technology. But that doesn't mean you give up on an innovation strategy. It means that you build innovation into the way that you're building these manufacturing facilities now.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense to me. And so clearly the United States is intent on trying to catch up on its battery industry. And the Inflation Reduction Act that was announced last month is clearly aiming at that. There's all sorts of announcements coming out about battery investments from non-North American firms who are setting up plant in Canada and the United States. There are conversations between the US and Canada at the government level about critical minerals and refining and processing those minerals. So all of that is great. We seem to have gotten the message, and we're busy working our way towards that. But you brought up Jigar Shah. And Jigar Shah is not so well known in Canada, but very well known in the US as a financier of new technologies and innovation. He's been tapped by Joe Biden to head up the US Department of Energy's loan program. It's tens of billions of dollars that he has, that he'll be loaning out. And it seems there's a fundamental difference between the way the Americans approach these kind of challenges and the way the Canadians do. The Americans have decided, okay, we're behind here. We're going to catch up, and we're going to open up the money spigot, and we're going to spend money, and we're going to partner with industry, and we're going to do this in a big way. Whereas in Canada, we kind of sprinkle money around here and there, and we try to do things on the cheap, and try not to. We don't want to raise taxes. We don't want to pick winners. We don't want to do all of these horrible things. So we do is we talk a good game, and we kind of then do it on the cheap. And that's my take on it. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think that for a long time, American industrial strategy, and it's always had, was really centered on doing what we would call like first stage innovation, right? Developing novelty, developing new things. And they did that through ARPA-E, through DARPA, through the really generous R&D programs that the Department of Energy has always promoted. But basically there was very little support for commercialization. And what the kind of revolution that Jigar is instituting within the DOE is to say, okay, wait a minute, the DOE's job is not just to seed stuff, but to seed stuff, get it to the commercial stage, do that first of a kind investment through a loan guarantee or whatever, and then hand them off to institutional investors. And that's the model that they're doing, where they're going to walk them through the valley of death from TRL, 6, 7 through to 10, and then they need to get their own first big institutional investor once the technology is actually proven on the other side of it. And I think that's a real strategic approach that is new to what they're doing. And they're making sector strategies and roadmaps in every single key area. So on Friday, they released the SAF roadmap. The day before, they released the hydrogen roadmap. And these are really good. The hydrogen roadmap has targets in it. The SAF roadmap has targets in it. This is exactly what we did in the battery metals. And I'm also doing a SAF roadmap with the Canadian Council for Sustainable Aviation Fuel right now. You can have me back on the show in 6 weeks or so, and we can talk about that. But they are really taking a strategic approach, laying down targets, aligning industry and government investment together, and taking an active approach to those supply chains. So it's not even that we're being cheap. I think there are big pots of money in Canada that could make a really big difference. I think if you add up all the money in the net zero space, I mean, first of all, just in the SIF and in the Canada Growth Fund, you've got 22 billion, you got 4 billion more in the Critical Minerals Fund. There's 1.5 in the Clean Fuels Fund. There's some money in the Canada account. We easily have $35 billion that we could spend on the transition right now. That's a lot of money. I mean, Jigar has about 40, right? That's a lot of money that we could be using. The key is to use that money actively rather than passively. So the Strategic Innovation Fund just receives applications. They don't do a strategic analysis of every supply chain, tell everybody what the goal is, tell everybody what the plan is. And that's what they really need to do. They really need to sit down, take an active approach, do a supply chain strategy, and to draw on expertise when they're doing it. The Department of Energy, these national labs that we're talking about, these national labs are staffed with the best academics and bench scientists in the country. And when the DOE goes to tweak some piece of a regulation, or when the EPA goes to tweak some piece of a regulation, or when they're coming up with the tiering structures for the hydrogen tax credit, the United States government can go down into those labs, pull out the best people, the very best minds, whether they're in academia or in the lab as staff scientists, or just adjacent in those networks, and get them to actually inform what's going on. So they're doing strategy, and then they're matching that with the absolute best expertise. And so when the American system works really well, which isn't always, but it is working really well right now, that's what they can bring to the table. And we miss none of those elements do we have operating properly in the Canadian ecosystem right now.
Yeah, I've had the good fortune to interview a number of experts from those various laboratories, and the amount of modeling and research they do is absolutely mind-boggling. And it was only a couple of months ago that the Canadian government's, finally got it. They said, you know what, we're not modeling any of this stuff. We were talking about, fundamental seismic shifts in our economy, and we don't really model the effect on, the oil and gas industry, or, what kind of skills are going to be required in our workforce. And oh, by the way, here's $5 million. Let's see if we can't, close that huge gap between us and the Americans. We'll give you $5 million, which is, like the coffee fund in the PMO. And it seems to me to be emblematic. It's a symbol of the American approach versus the Canadian approach. And I know you're plugged into what's going on in Ottawa, and you consult, you're talking to the various bureaucrats in the Department of Natural Resources or climate change and so on. Do they get it? Like, do the politicians get it?
I think the expertise and the modeling is there. I think we have the capacity and the expertise. It's just not being activated properly. Because there's no strategic process. Like, if you take the hydrogen strategy, it's being run without a strategic process, right? Like, they have 10 subcommittees, and those subcommittees they're just talking groups. They don't actually have a target, and they don't have a clear sense of where the hydrogen is actually going to get deployed, and a clear sense of what that downstream market is going to be and when it needs to be ready. So there's the lights are on. There's somebody is in the kitchen, but it's just not clear whether all the ingredients are actually coming out on the table and adding up to a meal. That's where I think we really need to focus, is getting a strategic initiative off the ground that tries to draw these things actually together.
And there's a fundamental problem here, Bentley, is, I had the good fortune back in the day to get a degree in Canadian history, and I did a lot of business and economic history. Yeah. And it's no great insight to say that Canada's economy has been, to a large extent, built on being hewers of wood and drawers of water. And it seems to me that the change in this energy transition is energy used to be always a commodity. It didn't matter if it was whale oil, or if it was coal, or it was oil, or it was gas. It was a commodity. You dug it up, or you mined it, or you got it from someplace. And now energy is a technology. And that's a fundamental difference in the energy system that we're building, and the expertise that's required, the industry that needs to be put in place to support that new energy system, all of that stuff. And I don't think, my impression is, again, I'm not talking to or interviewing the kind of high level folks that you are, but my impression is that it hasn't quite sunk into the Canadian psyche yet.
Yeah, I think the level of the emergency that's on our table economically hasn't sunk in. I think you just need to look at the export table and see that oil and gas is $120 billion a year, and imagine what happens when that goes to 30 or $25 billion a year, and you start to think, oh, we have $100 billion that we got to find somewhere in our economy in order to make our books balance. And I don't think that's sunk in. Right? There seems to be some denial about the inevitability of that future. And that seems to me to be a major, major liability. I also think there's a lot of denial about how effective the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be. And I don't think there's the level of seriousness. Like, I remember when the Build Back Better was first proposed and it excluded Canada from the supply chains, it was like an all hands on deck emergency. Everybody was focused on this. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act should be the same way. All the government's energies right now should be focused on making sure that the fall economic statement and the budget in February aligns Canada with those tax credits to ensure that we have a competitive investment case. And that level of emergency, I do not see that. And that deeply concerns me. And just to get back to your broader point about Canada's position in the global economy, this goes back, I think, to your first question, which is, are we catching up or not, or catching up or competing on the future economy? to me, there's a big question about what are we catching up on? What does China actually dominate? China dominates the supply chain. It doesn't dominate these high technology areas. It's still trying to make its electric vehicles competitive with Tesla. And it hasn't gotten there. It hasn't gotten the reliability of its batteries up. It hasn't gotten the reliability of its vehicles up yet. It's not at the standard of VW or Tesla. So they are still trying to catch up to the technological frontier with the best Western firms on actual construction of EVs. But what they own is making graphite, which is not technologically complex. So we don't need to like innovate to make graphite better. We just need to do it. We just need to actually get it out of the ground and do it. And that requires some policy adjustments. That requires some active investment by the state to take a risk where a firm doesn't want to take a risk, to dig these things up and actually get the case made for an investor and maybe take the first tranche of subordinated debt so that the first loss is on the government's balance sheet and not on the institutional investor's balance sheet. There's lots of things that could be done to get that investment happening upstream in the EV industry. But that would actually take a strategic approach. But we don't have to catch up on the technological frontier. We're already there. Nano One has gotten everybody's attention globally as being a potentially disruptive technology that would disrupt Umicore and BASF and these large chemical firms in Europe, but also their competitors in Asia, LG Chem. We are good at that already, and so is the United States. They have a couple of firms that are kind of in that same midstream space as Nano One, such as Mitrachem, which is innovating basically how you tweak the chemical process to produce different chemistries. And that's the kind of stuff that, we're going to see big American and Canadian firms come into that midstream space and help give us capacity there. And that's really important. But we're not actually need to compete or catch up there. What we need to catch up on is constructing the supply chains. And that requires not doubling down on innovation in the old sense, but innovation in terms of like, let's build the manufacturing supply chain, and then we can do secondary innovation, not the production of novelty, but the improvement of the supply chain and the manufacturing processes that are already on the table. That's actually how Japan and Korea beat American manufacturing, was they got supply lines. And Hyundai sucked at making cars in the 1970s. They were terrible at it. But you know what they did in their industrial strategy? They empowered the guys on the shop floor. The middle managers who were on the floor, they got to have a direct line to the management as to how they could improve those processes. And they got better at what we call secondary innovation on top of processes that are already operating. And that's what the Japanese and the Koreans did in order to produce cars more effectively. And now we all produce cars basically on the Japanese and the Korean model because they were better at managing the shop floor. And we don't think of that as innovation, right? Because they didn't patent it. They just got really good at process. But getting really good at process is what we have to do from the mine all the way to the vehicle construction.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of literature, as you well know, on innovation as an iterative process, and just getting better at small steps at a time until you become really good at something. And I have to tell you this story about my first job as a reporter was in 1988, and we had one of the editors in the newsroom had a 1986 Hyundai Pony. Must have been one of the first ones they brought over to North America. And she came in one day and she'd had to take a cab because the radiator spout fell off, just a poor weld. The quality was so poor that the radiator spout just fell off one morning, and then she had to get it towed into the shop to get it repaired. That's pretty poor quality. And so, okay, we've talked about a lot of different approaches here, and I want to zero in on one that you brought up because you talked about Canadian governments taking a different approach to investment, the state stepping up and providing capital to bridge the valley of death in the investment cycle, that sort of thing. And it seems to me I'm hearing now or reading in a way that I didn't, well, let me back up. I'll provide some more context. I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, graduated high school in 77. So my childhood was dominated by the welfare state and the growing role of government in the Canadian economy. But in the 70s, we started to hear about Milton Friedman. And when, we saw, Margaret Thatcher elected in Britain in 1979 and Ronald Reagan in the US in 1980. And you had this reaction against that. It was all about the private sector and all about markets. 40 years later, what are we hearing now? We're getting back to the active state, what Mariana Mazzucato calls the entrepreneurial state.
Right.
And that hasn't sunk in yet. I see it happening in the US, and especially with the Inflation Reduction Act and Jigar Shah's office, and I don't see that happening in Canada as well. We're still at that sort of hands off. We're going to let the private sector do it, and we'll just try to facilitate that with tax credits and subsidies and so on. And what's your take on is the entrepreneurial state emerging at either the federal level in Canada or at the various, the provincial level?
Yeah, I think I see little pockets of it here and there. I think what Champagne's office did on the EV supply chain, that was an active approach. They had an idea in their head about what they wanted it to look like, and they went out and they built it. And that's great. I think there's obviously more that could have been done in terms of making sure that those downstream investments in cathode factories, battery factories, and vehicle assembly were tied to the development of Canadian minerals. I think more could have been done strategically. I don't know what's on those term sheets, so I can't say with full confidence that they didn't put the hooks in there that I would like to see, but I don't see the response happening in the mining sector that I expected, actually. So I think we're starting to get to the point where we can draw the conclusion that those hooks weren't there, or that those hooks are not being pulled effectively. But there was a strategy there, and they executed. There are rumblings that the Canada Growth Fund, which was announced in the budget in March, and the operationalization of this happening right now, that it'll be able to take a more active approach. And the model there would be Quebec, which Invest Quebec does this. They are the lead investor. They know what the supply chain should look like, and they go out there and they try to build it. They make sure that the lithium mines and the graphite mines are coming online at the schedule that they want, to them to come online to. They have the cathode factory in Bécancour that is going to provide demand pull on that. And Invest Quebec is a really, an energetic and an active player in these investment markets. And so there are little pieces of it here and there, but obviously we need to understand the success of these things, the failures of these things, build knowledge around that, and learn a new way of doing things in Canada. I think, I'm not a big fan of this explanation, but one senior policymaker said to me that part of the problem is just that the only thing in Canada worse than finishing second is finishing first. And I think there is a little bit of that mentality that, well, if we're too bold, then that's a problem. And, although I'm Canadian, I lived most of my adult life in the United States, so maybe I don't have a problem being bold. But I think that's what we need at this moment, is we need something that is bold, that actually takes a political and an economic risk in order to at least provide some coherent argument as to how we're going to save ourselves from the looming crisis.
Let me provide a couple of examples to illustrate your point, Bentley. Premier Jason Kenney in Alberta, now that he's on the way out of office, it's just a couple more days, another week or two, and there'll be a new premier. He's being very frank in his interviews, and I saw some comments that he made about how the Alberta government under the UCP has viewed investment. It's very passive. We'll give you tax cuts, we'll give you subsidies, we'll give you, positive regulation, that kind of stuff. And that's it. Very, very what is often called neoliberal. And then you look next door in BC, which has an NDP government, and it actually has contracted with Mariana Mazzucato for strategic advice, and it isn't much different.
No, it's not.
It talks a better game. That's right. Or a more active game. But when it comes right down to it, the strategies and the policies and how it conducts itself is very similar. And and that to me is quite striking.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that to me, the interesting thing there is that actually Alberta's probably has more strategic capacity in the government than other governments do, because they deployed that strategic capacity for decades to build the oil and gas industry. And so actually the tools are there. They just need to be activated and used for the new technologies that are going to actually produce jobs for Albertans in the coming century, as opposed to the one that produced the jobs for the last century. And I think that's an interesting kind of paradox about Alberta, which is that it's actually probably better positioned. And certainly I feel that way in BC. I spent the last 2 years living there, so I know what they're doing quite well. And I would say there is not a strategic approach to building the supply chains or to positioning the government or to positioning the province in the supply chains of the future. with the exception of forestry and natural gas. In those places, you see the state, the government taking a more active role. But yeah, the Mazzucato thing did not seem to produce what I would think of as being any kind of push towards a coherent green industrial strategy in British Columbia.
Bentley, it's fascinating conversation. I really appreciate this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Markham. Talk soon.